And with no further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Kendra Strauss. She's the director of the Labor Studies program and associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Dr. Strauss, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Bettina, and thank you, Caitlin, for organizing this today. So welcome. As Bettina said, I'm the director of the Labor Studies program here at SFU. The Labor Studies program is an interdisciplinary program that studies work and labor issues, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about how we do that. But what I'm going to be talking about today is really the pandemic. Were apparent before, but that we maybe just didn't think about very much. So I want to start today by acknowledging that we gather virtually on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam nations. Now, we might ask, beyond wanting to acknowledge where we are based and where our feet touch the ground today, what a land acknowledgement has to do with how we study work and employment. And one of the reasons that I always like to start my lectures and my classes with a territorial acknowledgement is because I would actually argue that the land that we're on and our relationship with the land as a settler colonial nation has everything to do with work and employment. So this lecture study will focus on how we study jobs and the economy, but really essential to those understandings of what work is in Canada, how we value work, how work is organized, and who does what kind of work is the way in which we are organized and structured around colonialism and capitalism. Those are two important concepts for how we understand our economy and understand work. And those concepts might be new to you, or they might be concepts that you have already studied and discussed in your own classes, whether at SFU or in your school. And if you come to SFU and you take courses, especially in labor studies, they're concepts that we unpack across all of the ways that we study work and employment. And you may have heard this kind of famous saying from Mark Twain, who's the author of Huckleberry Finn, probably his most famous book. By land, they're not making it anymore. One of the reasons that, this kind of comment resonates is that land, the value that we attach to land, is the basis of our economy and private property in particular. And that is precisely what connects our economy and labor with the question of how Canada is organized and exists on unceded territory. Okay, so I've already introduced a couple of kind of big words and big concepts. So I think what I'm going to do now is just give a little bit of an overview of the questions that I'm going to be trying to answer today, or that we're going to be answering together. And I just wanted to say that I know that some of you, particularly if you're in a classroom, may not have access to your own device for the chat, but please feel free to put questions or comments in the chat as I go along. Bettina will help me manage that. And so if you want clarification or if you want to comment on something, please feel free to do so. So the first kind of question that I'm going to address today is the question of how we actually understand work and labor in Canada and globally. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how work is organized and also what our economy looked like prior to the pandemic in Canada in terms of who was employed in what kinds of jobs. I'm also going to talk a little bit about what the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed about work and about labor and about the economy. And in particular, I'm going to talk about this sort of notion of essential work. Now, we could argue that essential work and essential workers have always been a part of our economy. But one thing the pandemic has done is made that work visible. And as I'll talk about, some of that work and some of those jobs have historically been invisible and undervalued in Canada. And that's in part, as I'll talk about, because they're low-paid jobs, and it's in part because of who does them. So that will lead me on to talk briefly about whose work has been most impacted by the pandemic. Because one of the things that has become very apparent as big agencies like Statistics Canada have started to show and tell us about unemployment since the pandemic through their statistics that they release, is that the impacts of the pandemic on unemployment, on work and labor and income have been really uneven. The pandemic has introduced really significant challenges for all of us, but some of us were better equipped before the pandemic to deal with those challenges. And for some, the pandemic has made existing forms of insecurity a lot worse. And then I'm going to kind of conclude with some thoughts about what the pandemic can tell us or help us think about in relation to the future of work. And the future of work has been a really big topic before the pandemic. Things like technological change, the rise of e-commerce, of social media as, the main platform by which people communicate and get their news. The fact that, many of us no longer go to physical stores to buy the things that we need. Those things were happening before the pandemic. But the pandemic has accelerated and exacerbated some of those trends. It's also showed us that things can be different, that we can do things differently from the way we have in the past. And so that's kind of what I'm going to finish on. And that will hopefully give us a good foundation to have a discussion or for you to ask questions about what we're talking about today. And I just wanted to quickly mention, as I said, I'm from the Labor Studies program, but I'm really drawing on some of the topics and some of the content that we discuss and kind of investigate in more detail in two of our first and second year courses, Introducing Labor Studies and Workers on the Global Economy. And the first course kind of really focuses in on labor and employment issues in Canada. And the second course, 201, opens it up to look at what work and labor look like around the world and how factors like globalization and migration impact labor markets today. So I've now been talking for a few minutes, and I want to just give us a little break, and I'm going to get you to answer a quick poll question. So if you are a student and you know what you're planning to study, you can respond to the poll. And then I want you, again, if you're a student, either a high school student or a university student, to just give us a sense of whether you think your subject or what you plan to study will help you get a job, when you finish university, if that's what you decide to do. Now, one of the reasons that we've sort of included this as a poll, and I'll just pause in a sec to let people who want to fill it in, is that school and university, or school and college, or school and a job, is the way that we think about work and careers. It's for the last 50 years to 100 years, how we all expect the transition to adulthood to happen. So I see that we've got some high school students, we've got some current students, and we've got people studying a range of different things. Sorry, I'm just gonna, there we go. But one of the things that the pandemic has really highlighted, and it's highlighted in ways that existed before the pandemic, but in a sense that are highlighted and exacerbated by the pandemic, is that the way that we think about and understand employment and careers is actually quite fragile and quite recent. So I mentioned capitalism, which is the way that our society is organized around a market economy. It's actually pretty recent. So for example, you know, for women, for adult women like me, 50 years ago, there would not have been an expectation that I would necessarily go to university or engage in paid employment. The expectations around my work were work in the home, housework. So the kinds of jobs that people have, the way those jobs are structured, the very idea of employment or a career as being something stable and continuous in our adult lives is really, really recent. And what the pandemic has suggested is that those expectations that we have about work are likely to change again. And for those of you who like films, you may notice that I've got two little pictures on the side of the slide here. One of them is from the movie WALL-E, which is one of my kids' favorite movies, even now as teenagers. And the other is from the second Blade Runner movie. Now, what these movies tell us is that as a society, our imagination about what the future of work is going to look like suggests that we're really ambivalent and concerned about changes in the way that work is organized and the role of technology. And so the way that we think about work and the things that are influencing work before the pandemic were already causing a great deal of uncertainty. Should I go to university? Are the subjects that people used to study the ones that are going to lead me to get a stable job? Are stable jobs going to exist in the same way in 5 to 10 years if, for example, AI and automation become much more prevalent in our labor market and in our economy? So the pandemic has really, in a sense, fast-forwarded us in relation to some of the issues that were already causing concern and disruption, but also already causing us to think in new ways about work, think more flexibly about work, think about the ability to work from home, which all of a sudden many of us are doing. So work and how we become workers is historically specific and has always been something that has been subject to change. Now, I'm just going to ask if Caitlin or Bettina could close the results of the poll for me, because they are just in front of the screen. I'm not sure if others can see that, but for me they are. So I will just, oh, there we go. I can close that down. So apologies for the break. Why labor studies? Well, labor studies is dedicated to understanding and asking and understanding exactly these questions. How do we think about work? How has work changed over time? Why is it important for us to actually understand the way employment and work function in our society? What's, I guess, a little bit different maybe about labor studies compared to a discipline like economics, for example, or my own discipline, I was trained as a human geographer, is that we start with the experiences of workers. So we try to understand how we as individuals, as communities and as societies understand and experience work, and how that shapes how work is distributed and other social processes, including processes like that contribute to inequality, processes that try to address inequality in particular kinds of ways, and processes that structure how our society works. The other thing just to mention quickly, because I understand that some of you might be joining us from a humanities class and other of you might be taking other subjects. One of the things that drew me to labor studies as a geographer is that we study work from a variety of disciplinary perspectives. So as a geographer, I'm really interested in how work is distributed spatially. We have English professors who are also interested in how labor is represented and analyzed in literary and popular texts. We have colleagues in environmental studies who understand the relationship between environmental politics and work. So work spans all facets of our societies and economies, and so we draw on multiple approaches to understand it. And part of this understanding, as I mentioned, and I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because, this is kind of getting into the slightly more theoretical and slightly more maybe technical aspects of how we understand work, but it's just a little taster of how we analyze work and understand the thing we call capitalism in labor studies. So, for those of you who may have heard the term, but never really understood exactly what we mean when we talk about capitalism. Capitalism is the name that we give to a social, political, and economic system like our own in Canada, in which production is privately controlled. In other words, most production happens through private companies, and most of those private companies make a profit. That's how our society is organized. Now, as a result, the people who do the work in this system generally don't own or control the means by which we produce the things that we use. Now, that's not to say people don't own small businesses or large businesses, but for the most part, we work for other people. I work for a university. Your own parents and yourselves, have probably worked for private companies in a variety of different sectors. Some of us work for the government. But we generally don't make the things that we use ourselves. We're a market-based economy. And to that question of what drives the technological change that is transforming work so quickly, much of what drives that change is the drive for higher productivity and more profits. And that's what makes our economy work. Some of you may have heard, on the radio or on TV or seen on social media, some of the reports of how something called GDP has been impacted by the pandemic. GDP stands for gross domestic product, and it kind of is the sum of everything we produce and make in Canada. And generally, we want that to keep going up. That's how we have a prosperous society. But what that does is it means that our economy and the technologies that drive them are constantly changing, and that can have really significant implications for workers. And it drives a lot of the uncertainty about what jobs there are going to be in the future and how we're going to do those jobs. The other thing that is a really key driver of our type of economy is the need for raw materials, the need for low labor costs in order to facilitate those profits. And so if we think about the history of Canada, I mentioned colonization. The drive for raw materials and for labor was part of what led to the colonization of Canada, of what is now Canada. And that's ongoing. I'm sure most of you have heard, your teachers or your professors or people in the news talk about globalization. And I think if most of us, look at the labels on the back of our clothes and look where what we're wearing is produced, it's probably not in Canada. So technological change, globalization, markets, the need for profit, these are all aspects of how our economies and societies are organized, and they are all the things that lead to the labor market in which we as workers find ourselves. So, what did the Canadian labor market look like before COVID-19? We hear a lot about Canada as, for example, a resource producing economy, and we absolutely are. Forestry, oil and gas, fisheries, these are all really, really important parts of our economy. But interestingly, they are not the sectors that actually employ the most people. And so this graph here on the, what is for me the right side of the screen, shows the changes in employment in Canada by industry between 1987 and 2007. And one of the first things we notice is that business, building, and support services were the fastest growing sector during that period in terms of employment, followed by professional, technical, and scientific services, healthcare and social assistance, construction, information, culture, and recreation. If we look at the very bottom of that graph, we notice that agriculture and manufacturing, those are the traditional jobs that the Canadian economy were built on, along with resource sector jobs, are actually decreasing in importance or employing fewer people. So the first thing to say about COVID-19 and the future of work is that Canada's economy was already changing before the pandemic. Now, this table is a little bit busy and a little bit difficult to read. And if this were kind of one of my normal classes or one of my remote lectures that I was having with a group of students, I would pause and I would ask everyone to try and take a look at what's in this table and using the chat to tell me some things that they notice about it. Now, I know that not everyone has access to the chat, so if you do notice anything in the table that you want to comment on, please do. But in the meantime, I will highlight just a couple of things that this table, and I apologize for all the small numbers, tells us about the Canadian economy. So the first thing to notice is that it breaks the job market down by men and women. And one of the things that I'm sure most of you will not be surprised to know is that gender is one of the biggest determinants of differences in employment in Canada. So one of the first things we notice, if we look at men's jobs between 1981 and 2019, is that men's labor market participation has actually gone down in Canada. So men were 94.9% of all employees in full-time jobs in 1981. They were 89.9% in 2019. And this reflects the fact that actually the proportion of men in the labor market has gone down as women have increased their labor market participation. So that's been one significant ongoing trend in Canada in relation to jobs. The other thing to notice, and some of you may know about this from the jobs that your parents do or other family members or even jobs that you've done yourself, is that unionized jobs, jobs where people, workers are represented by a union, have decreased really significantly. And most people who are in unionized jobs are now in the public sector, people like nurses or people like teachers. The other thing to just notice really quickly is that the wages, if we look over to the far side of the table, wages for full-time jobs have gone up a little bit for men between 1981 and 2019, and this is based on 2019 dollars, but they haven't actually gone up that much. They've actually gone up a little bit more for women. And in part-time jobs, women earn more than men do. But there's still a gender pay gap, which means that in general, women in Canada make less money, including in the same jobs, than men do. So again, our labor market is always changing. Who does work? Who does what kind of work? Who works outside of the home for pay? Who looks after children or older people in our communities? There have been huge changes, and one of the biggest ones has been women entering the labor market. The other big change in Canada is that Canadians who are racialized, that is, Black Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, and Canadians of color, make up an increasing proportion of workers in Canada's labor market. Now, many of us have heard politicians talk about Canada as a multicultural society. But the fact is, along with gender, inequality in Canada's labor market is very much based around identity to do with race and ethnic background. This is sometimes referred to as Canada's color-coded labor market. And I'm just going to kind of quickly go through a couple of indicators that give us a sense of what this actually looks like. So if we go back to 2006, before the global financial crisis that many of you would be far too young to remember, these were boom years in Canada. Racialized Canadians, even during the peak period of economic growth, had an unemployment rate that was at least 2 percentage points higher than non-racialized Canadians with the same experience and qualifications. So as I mentioned, wages have gone up a little bit in Canada over the last 20 to 30 years, but for racialized Canadians, they've actually declined. And what this means is that Canadians who are racialized, who are from immigrant backgrounds and are not white, are more likely to live in poverty. So in 2005, almost 20% of racialized families lived in poverty, compared with only 6% of non-racialized families. And a lot of this is because racialized workers, including immigrant workers who may have very high levels of education and qualifications in the countries from which they immigrated, are overrepresented in jobs that are precarious, that means insecure, and low paid. So, this is one of the things that should cause us to maybe question, particularly when we hear politicians talk about how well Canada does relative to other countries, whether multiculturalism does offer all Canadians the same opportunities in the labor market. So this was the situation, and then of course a pandemic hit. And the same Canadians who were in those low-paid jobs, those precarious jobs, many of whom were women, many of whom were racialized workers, have been the same workers who have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So on one side of the screen, there's a picture of a Syrian couple who came to Canada as refugees, who own a grocery store in Victoria and Vancouver Island, who kept their grocery store open through the pandemic in order to serve not only the Syrian and refugee community, but the broader community in Victoria. Grocery store workers are a really good example of workers who have historically been low paid, work often done by young people, women, and racialized workers, who are suddenly seen and recognized as essential workers. and in some cases given, hazard pay and wage top-ups. But that work is not work that has always been valued. On the other side of the screen, we see a diagram that shows that the greatest impacts in terms of the hours that people have been able to work during the pandemic has been on the lowest paid workers. And in some ways, we wouldn't be surprised by that. It's workers in hospitality and retail, accommodation and food services, people who work in coffee shops, people who work in hotels. But the question that this leaves us with is, who is really an essential worker in our economy? The pandemic has highlighted the contribution of essential workers. Workers in healthcare and seniors care, grocery store workers, cleaners, janitors, truckers, mail carriers, and logistics workers who deliver all of those Amazon packages for all those things that we've been ordered and had delivered to our homes. Childcare workers who provide daycare and other forms of childcare so that parents can work. And of course, the agricultural workers who pick our food, who process our food. But many of these jobs have historically been and continue to be low-paid and insecure jobs. And in some cases, they're low-paid and insecure in part because it is women and racialized workers who do them. So one of the questions we need to be asking ourselves about the future of work is, how will these jobs be valued after the pandemic? And will we continue to see essential workers as valuable workers in our society? And will we be prepared to pay them more and give them terms and conditions of work that recognize that they are essential? So that opens up the question of what is going to happen when eventually we get some kind of handle on the pandemic. What is the future of work after COVID? And, there are kind of two schools of thought on this. One of them is what we call a kind of techno-optimism, that all of us are using Zoom. All of us are using new technologies that are going to unlock creativity and innovation, that are going to potentially give us more time to work flexibly and have opportunities for leisure, and that will have less environmental impact because we don't need to commute to work, or we don't need to be using resources that were otherwise consumed by the kinds of jobs that we had. There's also a lot of techno-pessimism out there right now, and for very good reason. COVID-19 has produced more unemployment. Most people in our societies get their incomes from their jobs, and so more unemployment leads to more poverty, more inequality, and potentially more political instability. So the question is, going forward, who will win and who will lose? And there's one more poll which I'll invite you to do while I'm wrapping up my lecture if you're interested in. And the question is, how do you think the COVID pandemic is changing the labor market in BC? So what I want to finish on is the idea that COVID-19 has merely highlighted the question of how we're going to address whether technology will help us solve our problems. And, a movie like WALL-E gives us a very ambivalent answer to that question, or whether technology will make it worse. And what we encourage our students to think about in labor studies is that none of this is predetermined. The future of work is in our hands. And if COVID-19 has showed us anything, it's that our economy and our labor markets were not working for some workers before the pandemic, but that we can make changes when we need to support people to have secure income and good jobs. So worker organizing, an economy that's based around care, a new Green Deal that's focused on sustainable jobs. All of these kinds of things are opportunities that COVID-19 makes us think about. And those are exactly the kinds of things that we explore and debate when we talk about labor at SFU. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Strauss, for this contribution. We just shared the poll results. I think that many of the students will point out that it is changing the kind of jobs that are available, but also that there may be simply new jobs, and the number of jobs, depending which industries are opening and closing, will be available. I don't know whether you would like to comment on this last poll result.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually it represents exactly the fact that all of those things are happening right now. We are seeing jobs that many people rely on disappear or be reduced in ways that are very challenging. But we also see new kinds of jobs emerging that could offer opportunities for people to have better and more secure work. And so in BC, for example, our government has announced huge investment in recruiting and training healthcare workers. And those can be well-paid, secure jobs that are absolutely essential to our economy. So, you know, it's a period of real flux, and what this is going to look like in the long run is, I think, the big question that everybody's trying to figure out.
And I will not put you on the spot asking you to respond exactly.
Which I do not have the answer.
No, I think nobody has the answer, if we are quite honest. Sometimes students come to us and they may have heard of business and of economics, but they may not necessarily have heard of labor studies. In comparison to economics and business, how would you explain, in fact, to someone who may be interested in labor studies, may be interested in understanding the nature of work, what does labor studies give them?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I think what really differentiates us is that we, as a field, draw on different approaches from a variety of disciplines, including economics, to understand how workers and their communities experience and seek to change work and the economy. And so rather than seeing it as a sort of top-down, macro level process that is only influenced by, you know, corporations and the government, and that happens kind of way above where us as regular people are, we start from the perspective of what workers experience and understand about the work that they do. And so that opens up, for me at least, really exciting ways to explore things like gender, like racialization in labor markets, like the impacts of technological change and automation. And we really do so by focusing on the experiences of workers themselves and their communities.
Now, labor studies is not that old of a program, so to speak, but perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about the students with whom you're interacting every day, would this be remotely or would this be in person, so that we get an idea who is this student who is coming into labor studies, where are they going once they have finished, in fact, the degree?
Yeah, well, a lot of our students end up developing interests in particular areas. So we have students who are really interested, for example, in migration and immigration and the impacts on Canadian workers and Canadian labor markets. And that's partly because we're a country of immigrants, and many of us ourselves and our families have experienced what it's like to come to Canada. And so you can develop those kinds of interests through the duration of the program. And many of our students go on to do things like policy analysis. They work for unions and for government, researching and developing policy related to labor markets. We have a lot of students who go on to become teachers at a whole variety of levels, so social studies teachers, but also university professors in some cases. And then we have students who also work in the private sector, again on issues very much related to understanding labor market trends. So I think one of the things our program really gives students that ends up being very valuable in the job market is the ability to understand and analyze what's happening related to employment, and then to be able to use that analysis to, look at particular problems.
And I could imagine, since this is the main question that many parents of the students who are watching us right now have in mind, what is my child going to do with X studied at university? This understanding of the labor market and of the situation is something that will never go away. So you have a future guaranteed job, in fact, by studying labor studies, if you really think about it, because that will always continue to take place, though in very different shapes and forms. Can you talk a little bit about labor studies, where, like you mentioned yourself, that you come with a sociology, anthropology background. So what else could students who study in labor studies, since we know that they can do, for example, a double program as well, or they can do labor studies plus something else, what would some of the students do? Or some of them may only do a major, since this is now possible also for labor studies, but the combinations, in fact, that come up, do you have any feedback from students what they really enjoy doing?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think for many students, doing a major and a minor, or majoring in two subjects, is a really attractive and important way to have a concentration in at least two areas that might give you different skills and experiences. So we have lots of students who major and minor in programs like labor studies and sociology and anthropology. There's a clear overlap there, but also fields like political science. We have quite a few who also continue to study economics and then do labor studies as a complement. And we have students who actually come to us from other faculties as well. So health sciences, for example, I often have students in my classes who are interested in occupational health and safety issues, or workplace health. So one of our strengths as a program is that because we're interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, we actually work well with other programs, but allow people to have a specialization who are really interested in these issues, particularly to do with labor and labor markets and employment.
And if I remember correctly, one of the other strengths of your program is that you're really rooted in the community. So I was wondering whether you can talk a little bit more about that, because that is, we always say SFU is an engaged institution, the most engaged university in the country, but I think this is rings particularly true for labor studies. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's reflected in a couple of different ways. It's very much reflected in our courses and in the research that we do as a program. So, for example, in my research, I study the working conditions of people in the seniors care sector, which has been very, very topical during COVID-19. And to do that, I work with community organizations, I work with unions, and I work directly with workers themselves to tell me about what their experiences are like. And then I bring that research into the classroom to show my students how workers understand and experience their jobs. The other thing is that we really encourage and try and create opportunities for students to do experiential learning of various kinds. Labor studies is a really good fit for co-op placements. We have many co-op placements, with government and with organizations that are looking for people with the kinds of skills that you get in labor studies around analysis and writing. And then we really try and bring people in from the community. It's a little bit harder right now, but we tend to have visiting speakers in our classes. We tend to do public lectures and events that bring people in from the university and from the community, because topics related to labor are, relevant to everyone, and are, particularly in Vancouver and in the Lower Mainland, there are kind of a wide variety of sectors and industries and types of jobs that we connect with communities around, both for events and for research.
Now we have one question in the chat. I will just relate that to you. Do you find that psych nurses who work in the private senior homes do not get the COVID pay, but do in a hospital, that this sometimes make it hard to fill positions in long-term private care?
Absolutely. That's a very, I would sense from the question that Tracy, if that's their name, knows something about this sector. And it's one of the things that COVID has really highlighted is how different terms and conditions, including pay, has made it really hard for seniors facilities to attract and retain workers. And for people who are following the DC election right now, it's really become a key election issue. How do we fund and organize our seniors' care? And how do we do so in a way that ensures that we have a stable and well-trained workforce? And of course, workers in seniors' care were among the most vulnerable to actually catching COVID-19. So, you know, asking people to take those risks when they're not getting pay or they're not getting secure work is a big ask, and definitely affects recruitment and retention.
If you want to let students know how to find out more about labor studies, is there a particular site or is there a particular course or event, in fact, that labor studies is organizing right now? I understand these are perhaps a little different times, but let's say they would like to listen to more of what they've heard today. Where could they start?
Well, we have lots of information on the Labor Studies website, which you can easily find, you know, either on its own or through SFU. We have examples of our courses. We have things like, we have some resources for teachers who might be interested in having some resources to teach about labor in the classroom. And one of the things that we're really excited about, which we are in the process of organizing, is a whole year-long virtual online seminar series on Canadian and international labor topics that will be open to the public and advertised both to SFU students and to community members. So, you know, if people are interested, we're on Twitter, we have a Facebook page, you know, follow us on social media, have a look at the website, and, you know, if you have any questions, feel free to email us. We're always happy to tell people more about what we do.
Thank you so much. I placed, in fact, it's sfu.ca/labor. The website is easy to remember and easy to find. I believe that brings us to the end of the session today. I was looking whether there are any additional questions. If additional questions come up, by all means, continue emailing those to Caitlin. We can also then redirect them to Dr. Strauss and to her colleagues. So we are very interested in maintaining the discussion and continuing the conversation. For today, I'm very thankful for classes and others who have turned up. Thank you very much. Thank you to Dr. Strauss. And as with all the other lectures, they will be available on our electronic website, the FASS e-library website. So check it out. There's many others. Whether you're interested in the subject matters, you don't know yet what to study, or you don't know which course to take, that is perhaps one of the places where you can start. Again, thank you, and see you then in the next lecture. Thank you. Bye-bye.